Hello there, welcome back to the channel. This is Nerd Empire. Today we're delving into what is a relatively hot, controversial, sometimes, race within Star Trek, but personally one of my favourite civilizations, and that is the Kazon. A race I often revisit because I deeply believe they were underutilised and never fully explored. They were meant to encapsulate and reflect a certain element within human society, now, contemporary at least to the 90s anyway. I suppose that's still kind of nowish. God, the 90s was a long time ago. No, it wasn't. Anyway, I always felt that they were underutilized. I always personally really liked them, even though I will admit they are bargain bin Klingons. They are. But, nonetheless, we're going to look at, specifically, Maje Culluh today. So, I think we should start with exactly what is a Maje, because it's not a word that necessarily is common vernacular, is it? You could say, on one level, a Maje is like a captain. A Maje does seem to hold, on a general day-to-day basis, similar roles to a Starfleet captain. They are typically in command of a Kazon ship, station, or outpost of some description. Majes are local administrators and leaders of whatever local Kazon they are in charge of. So it's more broad than a captain, because a captain is a military rank. The Kazon generally resist militaristic structures like those of the Trabe and those of Starfleet, because they see them as oppressive. Bear in mind, the Kazon were once a slave race of the Trabe, and they see all things, like in uniform, to be bad. They were meant to be a hot take on gang violence in California, specifically in Los Angeles, during the 1990s. And you can see it in how they're structured. Their aversion to uniforms. It's like an aversion to the police. Their aversion to authority. Their desire to be free. But they're also borderline criminal acts. And they're only kept in check by the strength of their own leaders and whatever rules they happen to put in place. The Kazon, unlike the Klingons, are not really governed by the same sort of honor code, so they sort of default to an almost tribalistic state. This is actually down to the Trabe, who recognized that the Kazon, there was a lot of them, and they held them as slaves. The Kazon could easily turn on the Trabe and do a lot of damage if they wanted to do so. So they got the Kazon fighting amongst themselves, something they maybe perhaps weren't naturally inclined to do, in order to keep them off balance and prevent them unifying against them. Spoilers, that didn't work. Eventually the Kazon saw through this, unified, and actually overthrew the Trabe, but were unable to sustain that unity due to the ingrained divisions put within them by the Trabe. However, the Kazon do seem to demonstrate an innate desire for unity. On multiple occasions, multiple Kazon sects came together to work for common good. It was observed by Neelix that although the Majes are rivals, the different Kazon sects are rivals, they all control different things. They trade with each other and they fight with each other in equal measure. They will work together against common foes, as we also saw against Voyager. When the Kazon Culluh had a problem with Voyager, seemingly pretty much all the other Kazon ended up having a problem with Voyager, although there would be a counter-argument to make that perhaps the Kazon kind of have a problem with everybody. But the Culluh made a good effort to demonize Voyager in the eyes of the other Kazon and other races. So that's, in brief, what a Maje is. They're kind of the leader, they're kind of the captain, and they're sort of ranked. There are multiple Majes, as far as we can tell, within every sect. The first Maje, which is what Culluh would be, is the one that's in charge. And he has to be the toughest, meanest, most intelligent, most savage, most savvy of all the Kazon in his sect. And a sect is just a gang, or a tribe. Unfortunately, because the Kazon were never properly fleshed out as a people, we don't really get to see what the greater Kazon civilian civilization is like, but we can assume that they're ruled over by these sects overall, and young Kazon males, as we saw with individuals like Ka, will go and join a sect that they particularly want to be part of, go through the initiation rites and become a member of it to seek wealth and glory, or whatever the hell the Kazon seek ultimately in life. So that's what the Majes are. What does a Maje need in qualities? Now, similar to many leaders, they need to be charismatic, they need to be charming, they need to be actually very organized, good leaders of people, good at delegating resources, knowing what fights to fight and what fight to retreat from, picking their battles, basically. They also need to be a strong-willed individual to deal with a generally strong-willed other Kazon. They also need to be able to put down a problem when one of their subordinates perhaps challenges them. They need to have the strength of will, strength of character, the intelligence, the ruthlessness, but most importantly the savvy to be the leader amongst the Kazon that they rule, because similar to some other empires like the Klingons, maybe like the Terrans, there's always another Kazon looking at their position and going, I could do a better job than you, I want your job. And they need to be able to deal with that. So let's circle round to Maje Culluh, perhaps one of the most fleshed out of all the Kazon. What do we know about Culluh himself? Well, we know that he was the first Maje of the Kazon Nistrum, which by the 2370s was a shadow of its former self. It was once a great and powerful Kazon sect. In the early days of the founding of the sect, about 30 years earlier, well, probably more than that, but let's say 30 years, the Kazon Nistrum were very powerful. But that was in the days of his grandfather, who was a well-respected Kazon. Even Kazon Majes of Culluh's time still refer to his grandfather as a good leader, as a respected man. And Culluh has wasted the resources of the Nistrum in pointless petty bickering, poor leadership, poor resource allocation, and ultimately many of his own followers have gone to join other sects or have been killed in pointless violence. Culluh inherited the role of Maje rather than perhaps earned it. Although the Kazon under him feared him, this was because he ruled with an iron fist. Culluh ruled with brutish force rather than intelligence and cunning and charm. We saw with the other Majes they were far more intelligent, duplicitous, charismatic, generally easier to deal with. They were far more suited to the role. Culluh always felt like he was trying to live up to the legacy of his grandfather, rather than creating a legacy perhaps of his own. However, despite his, shall we say, I would put him as less intelligent than the other Kazon Majes. He was certainly not as smart as them, but he did have one redeeming quality. He was adaptable. When Culluh saw an opportunity for advancement, when he saw the circumstances changing, the tides moving against him or whatever, he was very adaptable. He was very good at maneuvering the pieces around the board to give himself the most advantageous outcome possible. For example, in Kazon culture, the women are second-class citizens. There's no evidence that they're anything as subdued as, say, Ferengi women, but certainly Kazon don't hold the same level of respect for their women that humans or Romulans or Klingons do. So when he encountered the Cardassian spy posing as a Bajoran Starfleet officer, Marquis Seska, in public, when they were together, she manipulated him, of course, but that's besides the point. He would be demeaning towards her, he'd put her down and tell her to watch her tongue and stay in her place, but in private, they were lovers, they conceived a child together, she would bear him a son, and he would listen to her advice because he was intelligent enough to at least to recognize that she knew what she was talking about. She was a competent engineer, she was a tactically well-rounded individual, and she brought something to the table that none of the other Kazon around him did, and that was experience, tactical knowledge, and information about Cardassian battle tactics, Starfleet battle tactics, Maquis battle tactics, and for that matter a relative familiarity with Kazon battle tactics. So therefore she understood that they could unify the sects, they could steal Voyager's technology, they could use it to force the other sects into line and create an empire. She knew that. Culluh also knew this, but he simply didn't know how to achieve it. She was the means to that end, and he did know that. So there was an element that he was adaptable enough to know when to use what pieces on the board, basically. But he himself, if left to his own devices, was something of a brutish leader and would kind of always default to a thuggish point of view. He was much more of a bruiser and a heavy-handed, well, Maje, than he was a cunning manipulator and leader of men. So he had his flaws, but he did love Seska. Whether or not that was returned was no, probably wasn't. And he did love his son. And he did love the Kazon overall. He was a patriot of his people. Despised the Trabe, and he wanted to see the Kazon prosper. He just wanted them to see him prosper under himself, which was, to be honest, probably no different than all the other Majes, which, again, going back to it, did seem to be something that was the main goal. It did seem to be something that the Kazon sect wanted, but they weren't together enough, and they were too selfish to really put aside their own individual power to work together for greater common good. But that's probably a bigger discussion for another time. Culluh was known to Voyager for about 2 years. In that entire time, he remained in charge of the Nistrum, and we did see the Nistrum's fortunes turn around, but I would personally attribute that more to Seska. He grew, however, a lot as a person, and we can only hope that perhaps his respect for women improved as a consequence of Seska, which, as a consequence, maybe we saw some improvement within greater Kazon culture as a result. But certainly, maybe we could have seen, if he continued it, we could have seen a reversal of the fortunes of the Nistrum, and perhaps one day the unification of the Kazon, although I don't think that would be a particularly good thing for the entire region of that Delta Quadrant, because a unified Kazon would probably be a Kazon Empire, rather than just a load of infighting sects that are pirates and thugs and bullies. But then again, as it was once pointed out, warp drive turned the Romulans from thugs and bullies into an empire. Unification will likely do the same thing to the Kazon. Also, he also demonstrated, as I should point out, the adaptability again to recognize the value of knowledge. It's a little understated because it seems like he's just a thief trying to steal stuff all the time. But he recognized that the technology of Voyager gave him an advantage. That knowledge was power. Information was power. These were perhaps things he learnt from Seska, but the point is he learnt them. And again, hopefully he took those lessons away with him. As I said, 2371, 2372, he was a big problem for Voyager. First encountered when he was allowed to board Voyager, and then he executed a member of the Nistrum that was in recovery in sickbay, so that he wouldn't tell Voyager, most likely, that they'd stolen replicator technology. He later was successful in actually taking over Voyager, but this was pretty much the last we saw of him, as Seska would be killed, and he'd take his son back to his ship and leave. But as I said, that is Maje Culluh, something of a laughingstock and a figure of ridicule amongst the other Kazon sects, but in an understated way, and perhaps in a way that, given a little guidance and help from the right person, Seska, he actually turned around to become a decent leader of his particular sect. Again, whether that continued on after him is unknown. The other Kazon Majes were far more rounded and were generally more competent individuals. That's why their sects flourished and grew stronger, with more Kazon flooding to them, while the Nistrum grew weaker year on year. But with Seska's help and the open-mindedness of Culluh, which seems like a contradiction, but hell, he did it. He did listen to her, he did listen to Seska, and he did have his respect for her in his own Kazon way. He demonstrated that there is potential in the Kazon to be more than what they are. And hopefully one day we'll actually see that. But that's Culluh. Let me know in the comment section below. I want to know what you guys think of the Kazon, because I had a conversation with another YouTuber recently. Jane Talks Trek, by the way, go subscribe to her channel. It is fantastic. If I remember, I'll link it in the comment section below in this video. Me and her were talking, and she likes the Kazon. But like everyone, it falls into a conversation of the Kazon are not really necessarily popular, or people see them again as discount Klingons, or a bit too crude and primitive and stupid. They're ridiculed, and I think that should be turned around. There's a case for them to be made for the Kazon to be a great power one day in the future, and an interesting civilization with a bit more development as a people. They could be great. But let me know in the comment section below what your personal opinion is on the Kazon. What did you think of them? Were you glad that they disappeared from Voyager once it was out of their space, or would you like to have seen a little more of them and perhaps seen them a little bit more rounded off? Or did you think they're just a lost cause and they're eventually going to kill each other into oblivion? But that is the end of this video. Went on a little longer than I expected, but if you made it all the way to the end, thank you for watching, and bye bye.